is a car that came to us just a day or so ago, and the purpose of this preliminary portion of the videotape is merely to show the car's condition as it was when we received it. As you can see, the hubcaps are missing, the bumpers are off, although we do have the bumpers here. The body at first glance looks pretty good. Now, we haven't done any investigation of the car at this point to actually determine its condition. But the owner tells us there's a lot of Bondo in it, and it has been, of course, repainted, and some other work has been done to it. But again, this is just more or less to show the car as we received it. So I'll just walk around the car so that there's a good record of what we have here. The car is drivable. The engine apparently has been freshly rebuilt, and we have driven the car in and out of the shop today, and we saw it being driven a bit at the in fact, we drove it up on the trailer, and so we know that it's drivable. There are a couple of boxes here in the trunk with parts in them. We have not yet opened the boxes, so we aren't certain just what parts are in there. But anyway, this is a good point from which to start. We do now have a record of what shape the car was in when we received it. At this point, we're well into the disassembly portion of the restoration project on this car, and as you can see, of course, we've removed the engine and most of the components from the engine compartment area, and also, of course, the hardtop is off and the interior is out, and we're in the process now of taking off the old rocker panels. This is the way we normally do it, so this is pretty much typical. When we have a car where we know that the front sheet metal is going to be replaced, we usually take that off also before we actually begin reconstruction. That is, we take the front sheet metal off before we begin to do the frame section. The reason for that is sometimes it's easier to do some of the repair work that needs to be done with the front sheet metal off the car. In this particular car, we have to replace this front frame tube, which is damaged by rust. And so it's imperative that we get the sheet metal off in order to do that job. Now, this portion of the frame tube that you're looking at here is not really the worst part. As you can see, there is some rust right in this corner, and some holes. But the bottom side of the tube is rusted to the point where there is either no metal left and it's just a hole, or else it's very, very thin. Of course, it doesn't show in this camera angle, but that's absolutely necessary to be replaced, and as I said, we've got to take the front end sheet metal off in order to do that, which in this case is alright because the sheet metal is full of plastic and old repairs anyway. We're at a point now where we've got the front end sheet metal pretty much all ready to disassemble. We have cut all the spot welds. This is quite a project, by the way. There are numerous spot welds all along this seam, and you can see where the round holes are, where we drilled out all the spot welds along the entire opening of the hood. And also we had to cut all the way around the grill opening. You can see where we've cut around there in order to release that. And in addition to that, at each of the forward door pillars, there are bolts that have to be taken out, and of course they've been in place for 30 years and they're difficult to get out. So to suffice it to say that we at this point have got quite a bit of time into removing this front sheet metal. So it's a little bit of an understatement to say, here we go, we're going to remove the sheet metal. But anyway, the work up to that has all been done, and now we're ready to go. And there it is, and of course now we're at a point where we can really get a good idea of what everything is like underneath, the condition, and some idea as to what will need to be done to repair this and so forth. Now before we remove the rear end sheet metal, we want to do some work on this front end, and that involves cleaning it up, sandblasting it, repainting it, and at the very least doing the rough assembly of the new sheet metal prior to getting too involved in the rear end. And the reason for that is that it gives us a good frame of reference as to fitting the parts. If we were to take all of the sheet metal off, we would lose the advantage of having the original dimension of the car. And unlike the factory where they have jigs and tools to get all their proper dimensions, we have to pretty much rely on what the original location of the parts was. So before we do the rear end now, we're going to continue to work on this front end. Now that that sheet metal is off, we can get a little better idea what we're working with here. And of course there's still a lot of old rubber or tar type undercoat on here, so it's very difficult to... Compressor came on. It's difficult to determine at this point just what condition this metal is in until we begin to scrape off some of the undercoat. But I can tell right now from looking at this jack port that there's definitely some rot in that area. And there's a flange that's supposed to be all along this edge that's missing, so that's obviously got a problem. Here's a continuation of that flange, and you can see from starting from this point and going all the way back into the jackport area, there's no flange there. So there's been some work done on this that'll have to be redone in order to get the proper strength back. Now also here we can see that this front frame tube, we knew this was going to be a problem. You can see that that's very badly deteriorated, and this bracket that's hanging down here that's rotted away is the point at which the front bumper is mounted to the frame. Actually, there's a couple of holes in that. You can see the holes now, and behind on the back side of those, on the back side of that part, there are nuts, threaded nuts, and the bumper bolts into that. As you can see, that's very, very weak. In looking at the sheet metal that we just removed from the car, of course, we can also give a good indication of what condition that's in at this point, and thereby we can justify replacing it. As you can see in the area of this headlight bucket, there's been a tremendous amount of tar put on there, and there's been some patching done. So this is really in rather bad shape, although it may look pretty good from the outside with the paint on it and everything else. Nevertheless, there's not much strength there, and the metal is pretty much gone. I think the car was depending on the plastic materials, the Bondo and so forth, to hold it together. And the same is true on the other side. You can see there's been an awful lot of tar put up under there. So of course when we replace this, it'll be all brand new metal, and we'll be back to original factory configuration. What we're doing here is installing the new front frame tube. You may recall from the estimate and from our earlier conversations that the front frame tube was in pretty bad shape, and so it was necessary to replace it. And so this is the new part now being welded in place. This is the first thing we wanted to do before we dug into the rest of that undercarriage, because this is critical to the strength of the frame unit and also the dimensional integrity. You've got to be careful when you disassemble these cars, and a lot of shops that don't know how to do them can ruin a car by taking too much of it apart before they begin reassembly. So by putting this new part back in prior to cutting apart the rest of the frame, we'll be able to maintain the proper dimensions of all the various parts. doing here is cutting out portions of the old floor using a plasma cutter. And we've already removed some of the old floors on the driver's side of the car. And we've already begun reconstruction of the frame. There are some new parts in here already. And the reason we do that is prior to tipping the car on its side, we like to get some of the structural strength back in the car. And so before we tip the car up on its side, we replace these two sections of frame that you see here, this new metal, in order to give us the strength necessary to tip the car up without risk of damaging the dimensional integrity of the car. Now, in looking at this undercarriage, we've already cut away the areas that were very badly deteriorated. Most of them, that is. There's a remaining rust hole or two there in the forward frame cap. This is on the passenger side of the car. And of course, we've already cut away a lot of the damaged metal on the other side. This being the driver's side of the car. So once we get all this metal cut away, as you can see, we've already ground the flange areas, that is the areas where the new parts are going to be welded in place. We've already ground that down to nice bright clean metal so we can get a good weld. Now the new parts that we're going to use are right here on the floor. This is a forward floor pan, and these long skinny pieces are some of the frame rails, and then there's a couple of other floor pans there. Now the areas that you see here that are black are, we've already painted those with a rust-proofing paint. And the reason for that is that once these parts are installed, these areas that are presently painted black would be inaccessible because they're covered up by other frame sections. And so we paint them in advance so that once they're in place, we can then paint the remaining portions of the floor, that is the parts that are not painted at this time. But these areas that are painted now, that way will be covered. And like I said, once these parts are installed, you can't get at these areas. So this is something that the factory never did. They just put bare metal together and they painted the outside surface, but they never painted the inside, and that's why the cars were so prone to rust. Here are some of the old parts that we cut away, the very thin and rotted metal. In doing our work on the underside of the car, we did find an area that must be addressed, and this is this area right here. This is part of the frame alongside the engine compartment on the underside of the car. And as you can see, there was some very, very thin metal here, and in tapping around with our pick hammer, we found this to be very thin. So this is going to have to be cut away and a patch panel fabricated from heavy gauge steel and welded back in place. Now, in addition to that, there's also one here on the underside. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a good camera shot at this or not. We'll see if I can get up underneath here. Yeah, there it is. Pretty much the same sort of a thing. It was just an area of very thin metal, and we tapped at it and broke through it, so that's an area that also will have to be repaired. Now, we're in the process at this time of preparing the inner parts of the frame prior to installing the floors. And as I mentioned to you earlier on this videotape, in looking at the floors, now they're turned around now so the back side is not visible, but in looking at these floors, you may recall that we painted certain portions of those because we indicated that they were not available to get at once they were installed in the car. And here we have the same situation going on the frame. These parts of the frame will no longer be accessible once the floors are put in place, so we paint them now with this rust-proofing material. This is a paint it's an anti-rust paint. We found it to be very effective. It's very tough. Had the factory done this originally when the cars were built back in the 50s and 60s, we would not have the severe rust problems that we have today with these cars. So with the car tipped up like this, now is a good time to take a look at the frame tube that we installed. You may recall that we had to replace the front frame tube, and here it is, all freshly installed and freshly welded in place. I'll try to visualize what we're looking at here. This frame tube would be directly underneath the radiator and behind the grille once the car is all back together again. There are some sheet metal parts missing, obviously, so it's a little bit hard to visualize what we're actually seeing here. But anyway, this is the front end of the car. As you can see, we're in the process here of installing the new floor pans, and this is on the passenger side of the car. The driver's side we have not yet begun the installation, but we're all ready. Once we get this done, this will pretty much complete the undercarriage portion of the project, and then we'll go on to the next project, the next phase of the project, which is replacing the upper body sheet metal fenders and so forth. We had been waiting for one small part, one little frame part that goes right in here, and that finally arrived, and so we're installing that now, and then that will allow us to put in the last two remaining pieces on this side, and that is the frame cap and the toe board. Now up here you can see the frame cap, and this is the toe board. This being the passenger side of the car, and the side we're working on right now is the driver's side. So that will finish up this undercarriage portion. I might also point out that we've got the rear wheelhouse in now, that is the spare tire well. And we also found a few areas of rust through up in here and along this frame tube. And those have now been taken care of. There was a little area down here where you see some bright, shiny, fresh metal, and that's another area where we did a little repair work. Here we are in the process of fitting the front end sheet metal prior to the final welding and final fitting of it. After a delay of about a week or two, because surprisingly there were no front end sheet metal parts in the United States at the time we ordered it. So we had to wait a week or two to get the parts in. But of course they're here now, and this is what takes place when this front end sheet metal is on. Of course the first step is to get the old metal off, and you've already seen that in the videotape. But now we're at a point where we're fitting the new stuff, and that's quite complicated. We have to reassemble the hood and the grille screen, which is in place. It's a little hard to see because of the darkness here, but the grille screen is in place. And the bumper has to be fitted in order to get proper alignment. And in short, all of the front end sheet metal has to be fitted in a preliminary mode in order to get proper alignment, in order to get proper gaps at the doors, as we have here, and along the hood all the way around its opening, the front and both sides of the hood. Plus the grille opening has to be aligned properly, and the alignment of the three parts. There are three basic parts here, the left and right front fender and also the nose panel. All these parts have to line up properly and be clamped in place, and then the front bumper has to be installed to ensure that the sheet metal is located properly so that the bumper brackets exit through the center of the holes that they're supposed to come out of. And so all of that has to be accomplished before any actual welding and final assembly can be done. And this is one of the things that, based on what we've seen from what other shops have done, we're probably one of the very few, if not the only shop that takes this much care in lining these parts up. Because often we find poor fits on either the bumper brackets or the hood or whatever, or the doors. But in any case, here we are at this point, and once we get to where we feel that we've got about the best alignment we get, we will tack weld these parts in place. That is, we'll tack weld the three pieces together, and at that point we will begin some other fitting, and that involves the removal of the nose panel after marking its location. Then we will trim the metal so it fits, and we have a what we call a butt joint on the weld. And when we get to that point, I'll show you what that is, and I'll explain what the purpose of that is. At this point, we have the sheet metal all welded together. That is the three parts. The two front fenders and the nose panel are now welded together as one unit. And I think on the last bit of video I indicated that there was a lot of fitting and preliminary fitting and shaping and so forth that had to be done, and adjustment and so forth. One of the other things we also do at this time, these two parts, the fender and the nose panel, are made in such a fashion that when they're lined up on the car, there's actually an overlap. In other words, the fenders are a little longer than they need to be, and the nose panel is a little longer than it needs to be along this area here. And so there's an overlap. Now the purpose of that, as the parts come from the factory, is to allow the installer some leeway in adjusting, because these hoods vary a bit in length, and that would give you the extra metal you would need to get a proper gap at the front of the hood, for example. And so they leave that extra metal there. Now 9 out of 10 shops, or virtually every shop that has done one of these cars prior to our seeing it, does the same thing. They put the two pieces of metal together, and there's the overlap of metal, and they just leave that overlap. They weld across the top and leave the overlap of metal on the underside open. That is, there's an area where the metal is overlapped, but it's not sealed around the leading edge. And that allows a perfect place for moisture and mud and whatever, road debris to get trapped, and it very quickly causes premature re-rusting. What we do is we line these parts all up. Once everything is clamped in place and we have a good fit, we mark the parts, then we disassemble, we cut along the mark and to remove the excess metal, then we put the parts back together and weld them together in such a fashion that the two pieces of metal are butted together and welded. And in that way there's no overlap. So if you were to look on the underside of this, and I don't know if you can see it or not, I'll try and get in here and show you what that looks like on the inside. Now there's the seam on the inside right there, and you can see there's no overlap of metal there. That's just metal to metal butted together and welded so that it now is one piece. And again, other shops leave that overlap of metal, which is usually 1 inch to 2 inches, and that's an area to trap rust in water. So we've accomplished this part of the job now. The next step will be to, now that these parts are welded together as one unit, to take them off the car. Then we will do our sandblasting of the engine compartment and the outside of the engine compartment sidewalls, and this whole front end of the car will be sandblasted with the sheet metal off it. Then we will paint, then we will reinstall the sheet metal and permanently weld it and bolt it in place. So that will be the next step in this operation, and then following that, of course, we'll go after the rear end sheet metal and we'll begin to install that. Well, here we are with the front end of the car freshly sandblasted, and as usual that gives us additional work to be done in these areas. Invariably there are areas where the metal is very thin and where there are tiny holes in it that did not show up before, and once you get the old undercoating off and the grease and the dirt and the old paint and whatever else, the rust, you invariably find additional areas of rust through and deterioration, and of course this car is typical. We have removed the battery box because the bottom of that was gone, and so of course we'll be installing a new battery box. But in addition to that, as I said, there are some areas where the metal is very thin and there's some additional holes in it. Here's a good example. These areas are always rusty on these cars. There is a piece of felt, quite thick felt, about 3/16 of an inch thick, that they used to line these tubes. These are actually the air intake tubes for the heating and ventilating system. And for some reason the Germans saw fit to put this felt liner in it. I don't know if that had to do with silencing the thing or what the purpose of it was, but in effect what it did was the felt would get wet, of course, from airborne water, either from rain or being thrown up from wet roads, and it would get in that felt, and the felt would remain wet for a long period of time, and therefore the metal underneath it would rust. And so here we are. This is, like I said, every one of these cars has rust in this area. This upper nose panel support, as it turns out, was also very thin, and you can see there are there's some rust holes in it right in here, so it may behoove us to replace that part. Also, we exposed some other areas down here where there's a little bit of rust through. This again is one of the common typical areas where they go, and so this is going to have to be repaired in here. You can see there's small holes all along this edge and some not so small holes. So that will be our next plan of attack, to repair these areas of recently discovered rust through, and then we will paint the whole thing, and then, as I mentioned on the earlier bit of video, we will then reinstall the front end sheet metal, which has already been fitted and tack welded in place. We'll reinstall it, permanently weld it in place, and that will finish up the front end of this car, except of course for the painting of this fresh metal here. At this point we're working on the rear end sheet metal. We've completed the work on the front sheet metal, and as you can see, we've removed the paint from the tail panel. Now, the tail panel is an original, factory original part. It has not been replaced at any time, as near as we can tell. There has been some work done on it, however, in the usual places. Down here in the corners, there's been some rust, and I might point out, notice the thickness of the plastic Bondo material on this right quarter panel. And as I said, there's been some rust repair down in this area. And the same is true on the other side, on the left side of the car. There's a rust hole there, and there's also been some patchwork done. There was a patch done here with braze. But all in all, the tail panel itself looks quite strong. It's a little bit unusual because quite often these cars have been hit in the rear end and the tail panel has been badly repaired or butchered up and so forth. This one looks all right. So I feel that we can save the tail panel. However, the quarter panels, I'm pretty sure are goners because of the amount of plastic that's in them. We're sure they're full of rust. And another clue to that is the shape of the eyebrow. This eyebrow is grossly exaggerated. It's about half again as thick as it should be, and that tells us that it's full of plastic, and so that quarter panel is probably going to have to go. But at this point, it looks like we'll be saving the tail panel but replacing the quarter panels. Now, also at this point, I wanted to show you that we have got the engine compartment all painted. It's all been sandblasted and painted, and so that's all ready to go. And as you can see, we've fitted the hood and the nose panel, and all the front end sheet metal is now done. So the next step will be to cut off these rear quarter panels and replace them with new parts. And we'll probably also have to repair the inner wheel houses at the same time. We just finished removing the left quarter panel, and so we have exposed the inner wheelhouse on the left side at the rear. And we had thought initially that we could replace this with a repair panel. There is available now an aftermarket repair section that is just the lip of this wheelhouse. Now, sometimes you can get away with that depending on what the condition of the rest of the wheelhouse is in. Unfortunately, this one is very, very thin in through this area here, and we're sure that if we were to put that repair section on, within a very short time there'd be holes appearing in here because this metal is so thin. So we have elected to replace this entire wheelhouse, and I suppose we're going to find the same thing on the other side, although we'll take a hard look at that when we get to that point. The quarter panel that we just took off is lying here on the floor, and as I mentioned earlier in this video, it was very, very heavily coated with plastic material. So there's almost no metal left here. It's virtually all plastic. This was part of the eyebrow, and that's pretty much all plastic. Well, after a wait of several weeks, we finally got the last part that we were waiting for on this car. We're missing one major body part, and that is the part that you're seeing here, which is the left rear wheelhouse. For some reason, there was a shortage of them in the country, and we had to wait for a shipment from Germany to arrive before we could get the part. But now it's here, and we're able to continue working on the car now. So what you're seeing here is the welding in place of that wheelhouse, and then after that we'll be able to fit the left rear fender, and then pretty much at the same time we'll be able to continue with the rear sheet metal work on the car. Well, here's that same area. Now that the welding is all done, we have painted this area down in here with a rust-proofing material, and so we're ready at this point to install the fender, which is laying here on the floor. we're doing here is installing the left quarter panel, and we're using screw nails. This is something that, as far as I know, no other shop does this. Everybody else has a hard time figuring out how to attach the steel fender to an aluminum pillar, and people glue them on, and they try to weld, and of course you can't weld dissimilar metals together. This was done at the factory. There's a 1/2-inch nail that has a screw thread on it, almost like a screw, and you drill a hole in it and you drive it on there. And that's how they did it at the factory. Well, as you can see, we just removed this right quarter panel, and we're in the process now of grinding the areas where we're going to be welding the new metal on. There's a couple of things here I wanted to point out. First of all, up in this corner, this thing right here, is the mounting pad for the cable tensioner for the convertible top, which of course eventually will be installed later in the job. But someone in the past had jammed a what appears to be a sheet metal screw or a wood screw into that part. You can just see the end of the screw sticking out there. Now that has ruined that little tab, because that's supposed to be threaded with regular 6mm thread, so a bolt will go in there. Now what we're going to have to do is remove this part and place a new part on there so that we can properly install that cable tensioner at some point in the future. Now also, I just wanted to mention that there had been some repair work done down here. Here is a patch that was put on it sometime in the past, and as you can see, it was put on with screws. So we will also remove this patch and weld a new patch in and do it properly. One other thing while we're in the same area here, what we're looking at now is the back end of the car, and what you're seeing in here is the trunk floor, of course, and this is the rear wheel opening. This pan right here has been apparently been patched up, and it's got a lot of tar and so forth on it. We're going to have to probably replace that part as well, because it was not properly repaired at some point in the past. Well, here we are with the right rear wheelhouse installed, and as you can see, we've painted it, we've sandblasted and wire brushed and cleaned the area in around this thing, and we've done our painting. And so the next step now will be to install the rear fender, but prior to that we've got to make up a trunk floor side panel that goes in here. I think I mentioned in the last bit of video that that area was in need of replacement, so we've got to do that next. And you might also notice that at this time that during the time we were waiting for things like paint to dry and so forth, we have accomplished some other work that actually is part of the next phase, and that is we've got to paint off the hood and the deck lid and the doors. So that's quite a bit of work that's already been done. So they are actually ready for final body work and paint at this point. Now that the new body panels have been welded in place, the final step in this operation is to cover the weld seams with lead, or actually it's lead tin body solder, and that's what's going on here. This is much better than using plastic filler materials because it tends to be stronger and it lasts longer, and it also helps to prevent rust for a longer period of time. The plastic body materials tend to absorb moisture, which promotes rust, and of course this does not absorb moisture. Also, the lead is a bit more flexible, and as the car is put in use and exposed to temperature extremes where the plastic materials may in some cases crack, the lead material will not. Now, as you can see, we've got a very good weld there. It's virtually an invisible weld seam to begin with, but even so, the lead helps to ensure filling of any tiny pinholes that might exist in the weld and allow moisture to get in. So this again is further further insurance against that. Now this, of course, this particular weld seam goes all the way around the fender, the whole contour of the fender, starting, as you can see, at the corner of the hood opening and going all the way around to the underneath the car to the bottom side. It's about overall about a 4-foot long weld seam, and this is on both sides of the car. And in addition to that, there's another weld seam right up here, where the at the cowl, where the fender is connected to the cowl piece. And also at the rear deck, there's another weld seam right in this area here. And again, all of these will be covered with lead. Also, I'm going to walk around the back of the car here for a moment. There's also a weld seam right here, as you can see, where the rear fender, or the quarter panel as it's called, is joined to the tail panel. And there's a seam down here, and then up here and across. Now, as you can see, we've got the tail lamp in place here, and the reason for that is to make sure that everything fits properly. And sometimes we have to do some rework on these, even on brand new factory parts. They don't always fit well, so at times it's necessary to rework them in order to get a good fit. This quarter panel we installed yesterday, or I should say we began to install it. There has not been any welding or trimming done yet, so we have to complete that. And again, there's a weld seam up here. Now this weld seam has been made, and it's been welded all the way around here, and it's secured all the way along the opening of the door edge. So remaining to do on this one is just that seam at the back, and then that will be finished also. At the request of the owner of this car, we pulled all the chrome parts off the shelf and laid them all out here so we could take some video of them. And we'll give them a little critique at this time, and along with our recommendations as to how to handle it. I also have a few other parts here that I think that the owner would be interested in seeing, and I'll get to those in a few minutes. But starting out with the chrome parts here, these of course are the wheel trim rings, and they are fairly presentable. I guess to maybe getting a little ahead of myself, but I might say that all of this chrome is usable to some extent. It all depends upon the quality and the level of restoration that's desired, and of course the appearance, the end result appearance of the car will depend upon that decision. And so we can't make that decision for the customer. All we can do is to show what we have in-house here and advise. So getting back to where I was initially, these are the wheel trim rings. These parts do have some dents and some scratches in them, but as I said, they are presentable and they are functional, so they could be used. The same is true of the hubcaps. Again, presentable, but not really all that great. There are some dents and some scratches in them that would be very difficult to show on the video here, just because we don't have enough definition here, and the glare of the sun and everything else to be considered makes it a little bit difficult to really get a good look at them. You'd have to be here and actually have the parts in your hand, and the same is true of these. Perhaps you can see some of the dents and scrapes and scratches in these wheel trim rings. Now, of course, it's always our recommendation, and again, this depends upon the customer's wishes, but our recommendation is, if you want a really top quality restoration, is to replace these parts. They are all still available. I realize they're not inexpensive, but the problem is if you replace one or two parts and not the others, or if you re-chrome plate a few parts and not the others, then you've got a situation where nothing matches. A freshly chrome plated part will make the parts that were not chrome plated make them look bad. These are the moldings that go along the top of the doors, and again, they are presentable. From a distance they look fine, but up close you can see that they're full of fine scratches and little pits and so forth. Tail light assembly. One of these had a problem, and I don't know if it's this one or the other one. Yeah, this is the one here. Now this one's probably alright. This one is probably usable, at least the bulb assembly is. Again, the lens has got some pitting in the chrome. It is functional. It's not broken, so it could be used. Now, accompanying this videotape will be a listing of the cost of some of these chrome parts that will help to make the decision as to what to replace and what not. The other tail light, as I recall, and that's over here. Let's take a look at that now. This has some problems. I don't think we're going to be able to use this. We could make it work, but it would not be right. This one is broken on the back, as you can see here. The mounting bolt is broken, and someone stuck this this bolt in here, which is not correct, and it makes for a bad mounting situation. Plus, there's not supposed to be two holes here. There should only be one. This hole, as you can see, has been enlarged, and it's no longer a round hole, so that would affect the ability to properly mount this part. And again, on the lens itself, there is some pitting and some scratching and so forth, but again, that's something that only the customer can decide what he wants to do with it. It's quite expensive, but I think this is probably a good usable part. This horn ring is better than most, and I would probably say let's go with this. I would not recommend replacing this at this point. This part is either made of die cast or aluminum. They came both ways. And once they do get bad, when they get corroded and pitted and the chrome starts flaking off, it's always our recommendation to replace this part, because it does not lend itself to replating. The chrome plating process just more or less ruins this part. The stone guards, just like everything else, dents and scratches, and functional the way they are, but really not very presentable. I wanted to show you one other thing on these stone guards. Whoever mounted them at one point was not aware of how they're supposed to be mounted, and this hole that you see here does not belong here. That hole does not belong there. It's not. It serves no function really, except that whoever put the things on didn't know how to properly secure them. So their answer was to drill a hole and run a sheet metal screw into the body of the car, and that's just not correct. There are clips on the back of these that evidence shows. Well, let me turn them over and show them to you. Clips, as you can see, they're pressed down flat against the back side of the stone guard. They should actually be tipped up a little bit, and if they were tipped up, they would fit in the slots in the body of the car, and that's what holds the thing up tight against the body of the car, not the hole that they drilled here. So someone did a great disservice by doing that to these parts. But in looking at the rest of the parts, like I said, they are full of dents and scratches, and should be replated at the very least. And these holes should be welded shut. The trunk star is badly pitted, and this does not lend itself to replating, because being made of die-cast metal, it tends to corrode down into the metal, and once you strip the old chrome off, you end up with a part that's very badly full of holes. Headlight rims, just like everything else, dented and scratched. Functional, but again, would not be very attractive on a freshly painted and fully restored car. The side moldings, we call them the eyebrow moldings, these four moldings here, and then the two rocker moldings. These are not expensive parts. They cannot be replated. They're made of aluminum. They're bright aluminum, and so we recommend replacing them. The grill, not too bad actually. The grill probably would probably be all right the way it is, except for this one dent right here. And let me see if I can point that out. Right there, there's quite a large dent. We may be able to remove some of that dent. The part is not badly rusted, and it probably could be used the way it is. The barrel, the center section here, of course, has been painted red, which is not correct. We would recommend going back to the aluminum color, or actually it was originally a cadmium plate on there, but we would get that red paint off. Also, we did not find a grill star with this car, so it does need a grill star. Okay, the bumpers on the car, with the exception of the rear bumper guards, which are badly damaged. You can see here they're misshapen and dented rather badly. These would have to have some rather serious work done to them in order for them to be functional. The rest of the bumpers, again, they are functional. They will clean up and look a little better than this, but just like with everything else, if you want a really good looking high quality job, I would recommend replating them to be in keeping with the rest of the level of the restoration. Now, like I said, this bumper on the front here will polish up and it'll look a lot better than it does now. There's a few dents in the guards, but the rear guards are badly smashed. Looks like someone probably tried to push the car with another car at one time and smashed these guards. One other thing that I wanted to point out, here's the fuse box cover. As you can see, it's broken. This is going to have to be replaced. And also in the non-chrome parts, here's the radiator, and as you can see, there's been some rather severe damage to this radiator. It apparently has been repaired to the point where it doesn't leak. But as you can see, several of the tubes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the tubes right down through the center have been cut off and rolled over and soldered shut, so that you're not getting all the cooling capacity that you should. So our recommendation would be to recore this radiator. And the cost to recore a radiator is about $200, $225. I haven't had to do one in the last 8 or 10 months or so, and so I'm maybe not on top of the prices right now, but it's going to be between $200 and $250 or $220 to recore that. I think that about covers it. Oh no, here's the lamps, the turn signal lamps that mount on the front fenders are actually on the nose panel. Again, they have some corrosion. They could be used, but they're not an expensive part. They're less than $40 each, and I would recommend replacing them. This one here might be a little bit better of the two. This one might not be too bad. But as I recall, this one was pitted. Yeah, there's some pitting and discoloration in that chrome, so that probably would be worthwhile to replace. Okay, that about covers it for the chrome parts, and hopefully this will help. This, along with the printed matter that accompanies this videotape, will hopefully help to make the decisions. One other thing I wanted to point out before I shut off here, and that is that there's a lot of small parts that also should be replated. I didn't bother to show them because it's just the time to do it and dig them out and so on would just be cost prohibitive. It would be cheaper to just go ahead and get them plated than it would to dig them out and talk about them. But things like door handles and window cranks and small parts like that may or may not have to be plated and or replaced. But again, the cost of doing it is not that significant. So these are the major parts, and this would represent the bulk of the cost as far as this part of the restoration goes. Going back to the car itself, as you can see at this point, we have the rocker panel installed on the left side of the car. Body work is, that is the body assembly work, is pretty much all done. We've got the front joints are leaded. The rear ones still have to be leaded, but all the grinding and sanding and fitting has been done on this side. Here is the rear axle, which now has been sandblasted along with the springs and repainted, and that can soon be put back into the car. And at this point we're in the process of preparing to fit the rocker panel. What you see us doing here is putting some caulking compound on that top of the frame rail, so that when we secure the rocker panel to that frame rail, it will tend to keep the water out. Water gets trapped up under there and it generates rust. Now these rocker panels, as you might notice, had been painted white at one time. These are not the rocker panels that were on this car originally. The customer asked us to try and save them, but I'll show you his rocker panels. They were really too bad to save. But he seemed concerned about the cost, so we did have a pair of used rocker panels that we can let you have for about half the cost of new ones. These are good rocker panels. It's just a matter of getting the paint off them. We're actually on the car originally, and the problem with them is that someone had brazed them on at one point, and in order to get them off the car, once they've been brazed on, they're supposed to be screwed and bolted on. But right along this edge here, the metal was just rotted away and gone. And by the time we got them off the car, they really weren't usable anymore. And the same is true on this end, and the same here. And as you can see, there's a lot of rust on the back side of these, and the metal is rather thin, so we didn't want to take a chance on putting these rocker panels back on the car, so we replaced them with this used set. Well, that about covers it for now. We're at a point now where we're very close to being totally complete with this phase of the job. There's a little bit left to do. the final assembly of the rocker panels and the fitting, and the last bit of lead work on these 4 seams at the back here, and that will pretty much finish up this phase. Then we will sandblast and repaint the trunk, and then the car will go into the paintwork phase. In fact, I think I mentioned earlier on the videotape we've already started on that, and here's the hood for the car. We're beginning to do some body work on that now in preparation for paint. And the same will be true of the deck lid and the doors, which we generally do first of all before we actually do the body itself. What's happening here is that the body skin is being prepared. We're doing the final metal finishing and so forth just prior to the application of finished materials. What we have done is we've had doors installed, and we've checked the gaps around the doors and the hood and the deck lid and ensured that that's all right. And then we took the doors back off so we could properly do our sanding and final body work on it. In addition to that, as you can see, we've sanded off most of the original factory primer from these new parts, the fenders and the quarter panels and nose panel and so forth. And the reason for that is that these parts, even though they're brand new as they come from the factory, sometimes have adjustment marks on them from the die stamping processes, file marks, minor dents from shipping and damage from handling and shipping and so forth. And they may not be terribly visible when the body primer is on there, or the factory primer is on, but once you get that primer off, you can see that this is a little bit spotted here, and the reason that is because we go over that with a flat board with some fine sandpaper on it, and the low spots, the paint does not sand off thoroughly, and the high spots is where the paint comes off first, so you can see those areas where the paint is still on there, or the primer, those were areas that actually were a little bit low due to waves or dents or ripples or whatever. So we get as much of that out as we can in our final preparation here before we begin putting the paint on. So the next step after we will continue with this operation for a period of time, getting these waves and ripples out and doing the final adjustment of the body panels and so forth, and then very soon we'll begin to apply the primer coats and eventually the color coats. Well, here we are at a stage just prior to putting the paint on the final color coat on the car, and we've done the final fitting of all the body panels, and as you may notice, we've got a good gap all the way around on the hood, and the doors and the trunk lid are the same way. We've got good fits on the body panels. The material you're seeing on the car now is a primer coat, and we have one more coat of primer to put on, and the body work is basically done at this point. And actually what I'm showing you now is just the door gaps and so forth. The primer coat is on now, the final prime coat, and we will put, I'm sorry, we have one more prime coat to put on, and we will block sand that with very fine sandpaper, and then the color will go on, and that will happen probably tomorrow. We would have done it today, but we ran into a little bit of a snag. We ordered paint, and what they sent us was the wrong paint, so we have to have another batch of paint mixed. Now what you're seeing, that's the off color here, the little yellow coloration is actually it's the undercoat, which is a sealer coat. It's underneath the primer, and after putting the 2 coats of primer on, then you do a little bit of sanding to get rid of some final little ripples or scratches or whatever, and then if you sand through that prime coat, that exposes the coat of sealer underneath, so that's what you're seeing. The final coat of primer that will be applied tomorrow will be the same color as this rather salmon color. Yesterday afternoon we sprayed the car, and this is the end result. It's a little hard to get a good camera angle in here because the spray booth is a little bit too small to get back as far as you need to get an overall view of the car, but it does look very good. Now, still remaining to be done, is to spray the doors and the deck lid and the hood and the small parts, the dashboard and the windshield pillars and hubcaps and the wheels and things like that. and we will do that today. And after about a week of curing time, we can begin to reassemble the car, to unmask it and clean things up, and begin the reassembly process. What you just saw was the interior of the car being prepared for painting. I hope you can hear me above all the noise in here, what with the air grinder going and the compressor. But at the same time, one man is doing the interior of the car, getting it ready for paint. We're also working on the chrome parts of the car and also the dashboard. As you can see here, the dashboard is painted. And there's also, the leather has also been put on the bottom section of it. And at this time we're cleaning up the chrome that goes on it in preparation for installing that. This is the forward wall of the convertible top well, and we've just removed the old leather that was on it, and we're now washing off the old adhesive. This is one of those little labor-intensive operations, and there's no other way to do it. We have to soak this entire part in lacquer thinner, first of all, to loosen the adhesive and separate the leather from the aluminum. Then peel off the old leather, and as you can see, what we're doing here is washing off the old adhesive to get it nice and clean again, and then after that we'll reinstall the new leather. And the reason it's important to get all of this old stuff off, all this old adhesive, is that if you don't, when you put the new leather on, you'll be able to see the lumpiness and the edges of the old adhesive. Now, we have already cut the hide for the pieces to go on here, plus the pieces that go on all the other interior parts of the car. So I'll be showing more video of that as we go along and as we install those pieces. What you're seeing here is the installation of the leather onto the convertible top well forward wall. And as you can see, we have one side covered already, and what you're seeing here is just the edge of the leather from the other side. And we're putting adhesive on now in preparation for gluing on the other piece of leather. Meanwhile, work continues on the rest of the car. We're at this time finishing up the painting of the interior and the trunk of the car. The engine compartment, of course, is already done, as is the front and rear suspension. And this, of course, is the piece of leather that's going to go on the other side of that top wall. What you see being done here is the installation of the leather in the convertible top well area. We've already installed the leather on the dashboard, and also at this time you'll see that we've got most of the components back in the engine compartment. Most of them are detailed and reinstalled. Of course, the engine's not in yet, but that will be the next. Also at this time we're working on other parts of the interior, the seats, cleaning up the door panels and so forth. We recently received the chrome plating back from the plater, and here's most of it. There's a few more pieces that are still in the box that we haven't unpackaged, but these are the major pieces, and so now we can begin to assemble these pieces and install them. On the back side of the major parts, such as the bumper parts and the grill wings, these are the grill wings, and the back side of the bumpers, we will paint these because they tend to get rusty, and so the paint helps to prevent rust in the future. Work on the car continues at this point, and we, as you can see, we've got some of the chrome back on. I still, of course, don't have the engine back in the car, but that's something that will be done soon. Leather work in the back area is done here, and as is the carpeting. And we've got part of the false floors, and we don't have the wooden false floor in this side yet, but it is in on that side. And of course, as you can see, the instruments are back in, except for the radio. We don't have the steering wheel on yet, obviously, but that will be also done soon. Also, at this time, we do not have the new tires yet. They are on order, and they should be here any day. The door panels on the car are ready to reinstall. However, before we do that, we have to adjust the windows, and before we can adjust the windows, the convertible top has to be installed. So we've got a few things we have to do yet before we can put the door panels on. Well, we finally got the last of the parts we were waiting for, and now we've completed the work on the car, with a few exceptions which I've pointed out to the customer in a letter. And this is what the car looks like, all done. As it turns out, the last part we were waiting for was a black steering wheel. For some reason, there were all kinds of white steering wheels available, but no black. And since this car has a black interior, we felt that the black steering wheel would be the way to go. I normally like to take this final video outdoors, but the weather's not that good here, and the roads are salty and icy and so forth, so that's why we're doing it inside, and there really isn't enough room to do the car justice. From a videotaping standpoint, they always look nicer outdoors in the sunlight, but unfortunately that's just not able to be done at this time. Now, you may recall from earlier in the video, we pretty much did the complete interior restoration with the exception of the door panels, and because they were in good enough shape that the customer elected to leave them as is. And also we did not do the sun visors because they also were on the borderline, and we didn't know if the customer wanted to go that route or not. But as you can see, of course, the dashboard's all new and the instruments are all in now and everything. We still do not have the radio in. We're waiting for a decision on the radio installation from the customer, whether or not to go with a original type radio or put the radio back in that was in the car or what. But the car looks very good. Now, we have not had an opportunity to drive it since we got it all back together because same reason I just pointed out, the roads are not good, and I didn't want to expose the car to the mud and the slop and the salt and the snow. But we have started it up, and it runs very well, and the engine sounds real nice. So I think it's probably going to be just fine. Now, there are also a couple of engine compartment things that are not completed. You may notice that there's no air cleaner and no air silencer and no connecting hose between the silencer and the air cleaner in the car. And the reason for that is that this car did not come to us with those parts. So at this point, we don't know if the customer has the parts at home or if they're just were not with the car or whatever. We have asked for a clarification on that. Now we still have to do the final buff and polish. We'll do that just before the car is delivered, and that way it's looking its best when the customer sees it for the first time after the restoration. Well, I'm going to shut down the camera now. We'll put the convertible top up and then take a little bit more video. Well, this is what it looks like with the top up. I might point out that these convertible tops, when they're brand new, are very, very tight, and it's difficult to get the top latch down. And so for a period of time, it's probably going to take two people to latch that top down. That's been true with about every car we've ever done. For some reason, the people that make these tops have a pattern that is a bit on the small side, which actually is a plus because they do tend to stretch out in time, and it's a lot better to have one that fits snug and looks good with a minimum of wrinkles than it is to have one that flops and bangs and clatters as you drive down the highway, because that would drive you nuts. And also they don't look as nice. This is one of the few sports cars from this period that actually looks good with the top up. The Jaguars and the Porsches of that same vintage and the Triumphs, I always felt never looked quite right with the tops in the up position. They just are kind of ugly. But this is quite attractive. The top fits very nicely. Its shape is designed nicely into the contours of the car, so it's a real nice situation. Well, that's about it. The car's virtually completed, except for a couple of minor things which I've pointed out. Some on this videotape and a few more on the letter that I've written to the customer. So the car's ready to drive and enjoy for many years.